Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm honored and humbled to be in your company. I learned a lot today during the workshop, and I wanted to expand on some of these topics. So there's kind of two lines going on here for people who were with us today and for people who were not. So I could have taken different routes with this paper. I opted for one particular route, which is really of looking into how emerging technologies kind of reclaim back a space to experience, to our sense of being a part of the world in which we live. So it's about body, it's about the senses. So in a way, this paper is also about separation, which is, or an antidote to separation, which is actually one of the evils that we are witnessing in today's world on a daily basis. I will not talk about the film explicitly, except for like one specific reference, but of course, you know, we can keep that discussion going on. But I think this presentation will actually lay out the turf for whatever is there to come. So, in 1992, Danish anthropologist Kirsten Hastrup declared in a well-known book chapter that images are unfit for the study of culture and social life. Stuck with invisible forms and patterns, they can only portray the surface of things, she said, not their deeply embedded meanings. Words, on the other hand, can move beyond that, offering us a capacity to convey explanations. In the build-up to her argument, Hastrup invoked the notion of thin descriptions, a concept that in anthropology is often used almost as an insult. The visual is to the written mode as thin description is to thick description, as a map giving us an overall overview of a landscape is to itinerary, giving us one route through a network of possible routes. So with these words, Hastrup referred back to Clifford Geertz's well-known distinction, and some of you are anthropologists or students of anthropology, so you've heard this. For those who are not, Geertz said that it is the duty of the anthropologist to explain rather than to just describe, to provide thick rather than thin descriptions. We must, for instance, be able to provide our readers with an understanding of whether a quick contraction of the eye is a nervous tic or a conscious act of communication. This was his standard example. Now, Hastrup's words struck down on the community of visual anthropologists and ethnographic filmmakers like a lightning in a gasoline tank, firing off a vast number of reactions. Hers was in fact an attack right at the heart of the mission of visual anthropology, a subdiscipline of mainstream anthropology that in those years was attempting at consolidating its own scientific status. Now, even though this may sound a bit paradoxical, I think that Hastrup was actually right. The visual is in fact the producer of thin descriptions. And yet, right here lies its own unique potential for offering an experience-near access to the world. Anthropologists have in fact devoted a lot of attention to the various passages that transform their first observations in the field into analysis. Yet they have devoted much less attention to that very moment in which they immerse themselves, bodies and minds, into the world. The moment, to paraphrase Paul Stoller, in which we not only attempt at penetrating the world, but also let the world penetrate us. As we conduct fieldwork, we quickly subjugate, with the help of written notes, our sensory experiences to concepts, narratives, and explanations. This is what we have been taught to do. We subjugate the thin to the thick. Yet, this process is far from neutral. The typification or textualization that conventionally accompanies the act of writing generates a set of unavoidable reductions. Tausig has suggested that the desire to explain always reduces the unknown to the known. So in this presentation, I want to suggest that the visual can offer us a precious opportunity for clinging on to that moment when the world penetrates us, for achieving that epistemological openness that, according to Michael Jackson, for those of you who are not anthropologists, is not the singer, he's a well-known anthropologist. So that Michael Jackson is, according to him, is fundamental for grasping the practical, pre-theoretical and embodied nature of knowledge. Images and the visual at large can help us go more in depth with our observations and perceptions before they get subjugated to interpretation and explanation, offering us new perspectives onto the mundane experience of being one with the world. basically this paper is in praise of the thin, of that suspended moment in which the world comes to us in a fairly direct fashion, not yet filtered by our thoughts and their inevitable anchorage in the past. This is the moment, to use the words of Russian theologian and art historian Pavel Florensky, of wonder, of doubt, and of endless questioning. And I want to suggest that what I call new images, that is, the images that inhabit contemporary digital habitats, hence not necessarily digital images. So that new images are good teachers of this openness. New, yet at the same time old things, they are, to use W.J.T. Mitchell's words, disturbing and disorienting our conventional ways of dealing with visual or visible knowledge. They ask us new yet old questions, functioning as an antidote to our anxious needs to fixate meanings. So I just let this run and I'll give you the solution, but try to figure out what's going on in that image. It's a very manual but very tricky process. So now let me get straight into the realm of new images, attempting at further explaining what I mean by them. So for those of us living in the wired parts of the world, it is evident that images do and are a lot of new things today. Images are networks, relations, and communities made visible. Think of hashtags and ads. They are geographies. Think of the incorporation of GPS metadata in the photos that we produce. And they are also things. Think of the material reality they rely upon, cables and hard drives. Or about the popularity of 3D printing, interactive documentaries, and wearable cameras that constantly invite us to engage with the material and social texture of the world surrounding us. And images are indeed also a plethora of different and partly new formats condensing in our smartphones. So we seem today to have undoubtedly left behind naive ideas about the image as a transparent window onto the world, and started acknowledging its relationality, reciprocality, performativity, and impermanence. We have accepted that images ask us to do things to them, to explore them with the help of cursors and fingers, to navigate in them by moving our smartphones, to inscribe metadata in them. We have learned to save, morph, and resize them, and to respect their ephemeral nature as they quickly fade away from our streams. So in order to explore the contribution that new images can give to our explorations of the world, I have opted to focus on a few selected technologies and practices that in my view combine particularly well with documentary film. I will hence mainly speak of iDocs, also known as interactive documentaries, and immersive documentaries that I consider to be a part of the family of iDocs. In order to close down possible terminological gaps, let me suggest that when we refer to iDocs, we conventionally think about documentaries that use interactivity as a delivery mechanism, and that therefore merge the practice of documentary film with the possibilities offered by the internet. Now, today we probably need to move beyond this definition, and just recently, during a panel on iDocs that we organized for the RAI Film Festival in Bristol, Judith Ashton, who's sitting here among us, and myself, further consolidated the idea that iDocs should actually be tackled as an independent brand, as where the I in iDoc may stand for a multiplicity of significations. So, disregarding the original meaning of the terms that compose iDocs, it can simply be, we can say that iDocs can simply be looked at as a new visual form, one that expresses itself, as I have shown in a recent piece on iDocs in India, also in the absence of computer-driven interactivity. Anyway, in a couple of forthcoming publications, I have tried to put together a typological continuum for defining iDocs. We were talking really about this today. And of course, for doing that, I've been merging the work of Gaudenzi and Aston and Kate Nash. So according to this very square typology, the field of iDocs can be split up into three main areas: active, participatory, and immersive. And bear in mind, I consider this to be a continuum. Yeah? So these are not bulletproof categories. This is kind of an expanded continuum of iDocs. It's kind of an open space. So with the first of these categories, and this should be just a tool for starting to dig into this terrain, I refer to those documentaries that offer the viewers a variety of angles from which to explore the materials that make up the documentary itself. Let me skip a bit further. Conventionally using different media, these iDocs constitute the creative archive that does not, however, allow viewers to actively change or expand the materials on display, unless minimally by inserting comments, etc. Making up the vast majority of iDocs present in the market, such products can be exemplified by projects such as I Love Your Work, on top left, on the lesbian porn industry, and Choose Your Own Documentary, a live performance where spectators have to choose the narrative path by voting. It's kind of a repetition of Radu Cizera's Kinoautomat from the 1960s. Now, participatory iDocs instead seem to focus primarily on the creation of new materials. Sharing the very process of editing and production with the viewers, these iDocs are exemplified by Al Jazeera's Palestine Remix, on the bottom left, where viewers are asked to actively re-edit snippets of material on Palestine taken from Al Jazeera's own archives. And another example of this type of iDocs could be A Journal of Insomnia, where you see my face up there. A production by the National Film Board of Canada, where the materials uploaded can only be visited upon a nightly appointment, and where visitors are also interviewed on the basis of their experiences of this particular condition or disease that I, as evident, also suffer from. Finally, immersive iDocs are, in my view, the ones aiming at more explicitly closing the gap between the image and the everyday lived experiences of the viewers, both physically and metaphorically. Potentially experiential, haptic, and or emphatic, such iDocs move along a continuum that goes from expanded and placed participatory forms bordering to augmented reality to VR documentaries. Examples of this can therefore be Karen, on the top left, a smartphone application bringing a therapist into the life of the user. Building upon the principle of provocation and disturbance, Karen sends out SMS-looking messages, asking viewers to connect with her, even in the middle of the night. She progressively grabs information about the user's views and habits and provokes them to rethink their own lives. On the other end of the immersive continuum, we have VR and 360-degree documentaries. Ranging from online documentaries to those designed for VR goggles or smartphones, such products offer indeed an intensely interactive experience, allowing, however, not for the kind of embodiment that we get promised, but what I call a disembodied form of embodiment. Here you see a production by The Guardian on solitary confinement. Spinning further into this terrain, we could also mention proper augmented reality experiences, such as the India-US collaboration Priya Shakti, which among its various strands engages with the augmented reality app Blipa in order to allow viewers to discover extra content while exploring images in physical space. So now, while different from each other in terms of the actions and interactions that they engender, these different types of iDocs have in common a desire to close down the distance between the viewer, the image, and the world it contains. Instigators of dialogues between viewers and things, viewers and viewers, iDocs blur also the distance between the self and the world. Offering multiple perspectives, they also leave room for a sense of uncertainty, of openness and doubt. In an iDoc, I can seldom walk the same path twice, namely. So in order to further explore the dialectic engendered by new images and the politics that underpins them, as well as their potentiality as tools of research, I need now to open up a short art historical parenthesis. I know there are some students of art history, so I hope I'm not saying something really stupid. As you know, I'm schooled as an anthropologist. So the two dominating languages, visual languages of modernity, cinema and photography, build on rules and assumptions that they have inherited from previous visual practices, and in particular from Renaissance perspective. Inspired by Alhazen's 11th century Book of Optics, where the act of looking is for the first time visualized as a pyramid, with the eye on the one end and the visible field on the other, European painters, architects, and mathematicians started towards the 16th century developing a mathematical geometrical formula capable of converting three-dimensional depth into a flat surface. While being far from uncontested, perspective quickly became recognized as a natural model of vision, one materializing also Descartes' theorization of the body-mind distinction, which was happening at the same time, more or less. A reflection of the West's growing obsession with rationality and lines, perspective had a particular politics to it. Divulgated with the help of a window, allowing to measure the visual field, it generated a strict separation between the observer and the observed. Pushing the viewer out of the image and lifting them up to the level of God, it made the act of looking synonymous to an act of control. According to perspective, there is therefore no reciprocity. The viewers exercise control upon the image and hence upon the world, and no longer need to situate themselves within it. Geometrical perspective created therefore a space that was simultaneously aesthetic, analytical, and political, managing ultimately to tame vision. Inserting itself in the long struggle between the text and the visual icon that characterized medieval Europe, perspective rationalized the image, moving it from the realm of magic into the terrain of representation. And it is from here that we have inherited our mainstream ways of engaging with the camera as a tool for documenting the world out there. This is the story of anthropology, documentary film, and visual sociology as well. So indeed, the natural status of perspective can be easily questioned by traveling in space and time. Different civilizations have reproduced visual depth with the use of other strategies. Japanese and Chinese scrolls wrap the viewers in images both horizontally as well as vertically, while Mughal paintings, the top right, use color and symbols as a tool for conveying depth. And in relation to these images, you don't have to be in one single place. There's no privileged point of observation. You can be anywhere. And where you are, you get just a new perspective on the same story. And in Europe too, Byzantine art made an intensive use of materiality in order to convey profundity. Icons were commonly crafted with the help of materials whose texture would provide the viewer with a simultaneous sense of depth and tactility. The use of metal notably helped detaching the icon from its representational duty, while anchoring the image in the lived world of the worshipper. On the surface of the thin, golden layers that surrounds the icon, the viewers could see themselves and the actual world surrounding them. And the swallowing effect could be even grander in human-built environments. Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches, designed under the influence of Byzantium, literally embraced, devoured the viewer, as in the case of the mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna on the top left. These churches were filled with visual details on the inside. The use of mosaic in particular, with its variety of different materials capable of absorbing and diffracting the light in different ways, would have a deceiving and displacing effect on the viewers, not too dissimilarly from VR. It diluted their perception of the dimensions of the space in which they found themselves, hence leading to a transcendence of physical space altogether. Foregrounding presence rather than realist representation. Such visual practices are indeed still very much in use today in pockets, for instance, of Catholic popular culture. See multi-lenticular images. The Indian context too is indeed a rich provider of such instances. Prioritizing questions of effect, Indian devotional practices approach images as things that matter. A matter of shared reciprocity, the act of looking is in this context also an act of being looked at, an ongoing interpretation between the deity and the viewer. And indeed, moving closer to us, we could also consider the extent to which Western visual culture is filled by attempts at transcending the frame, the primacy of monocular vision, and of the privileged point of observation. This can be exemplified in the urges towards stereophotography that have characterized the entire history of photography, in the multiple experiments with reproducing panoramas and so forth. And it can also be found in cubisms, Dadaism, and futurisms that tends are converging on the same canvas multiple angles of observation, as well as in 3D cinema and much contemporary video art. So, to make a long story short, Western mainstream visual culture has relied upon a set of assumptions, somewhat acritically inherited from Renaissance perspective and reproduced through the camera and screen apparatuses, which foreground the duty of an image to represent by means of a separation from the world. As I have described through the examples above, such assumptions are, however, neither natural nor neutral. They have marginalized a vast variety of modalities that, just like Byzantine or Hindu icons, are more dialogic, tactile, experiential, and reciprocal in nature. Using the words of Pavel Florensky, we could say that we have simply accepted to be as monocular as Cyclops, metaphorically and quite literally too. So now, the new images, practices, and technologies that I have very quickly been presenting during the first part of this talk seem to bring, even though in different form, such parallel or counter-hegemonic ways of conceptualizing the image straight back to the heart of our visual culture, promoting indeed a change that is perhaps, as Crary inquiringly wrote in the early 1990s, a transformation in the nature of visuality probably more profound than the break that separates medieval imagery from Renaissance perspective. In their quest to overcome the separation between the observer and the observed, the viewer and the viewed, these images awaken in us a new yet old sense of wonder. Slow in reacting. So let me get to my conclusions. The assertion that new images contribute in reawakening our capacity to doubt and to experience a sense of wonder and a sense of being in the world brings me straight back to the question with which I opened up my presentation. As I said in the beginning of this talk, I believe that Kirsten Hastrup was indeed right. Images do in fact offer access to the thin rather than thick. Yet, this comment is derogatory only so far as we accept to hierarchize these terms following Clifford Geertz's own approach. And also, this is valid only if we accept to narrow down our understanding of what images, regardless of whether new or old, can actually do to us. Two of the films lined up for this festival, Forest of Bliss and Leviathan, Forest of Bliss is tonight, Leviathan is in a few days from now, are perfect examples of how images, in this case pretty old and flat in the case of tonight's film, can actually still allow us to enter into the cracks of the fragments that make up films, making us feel a part of the world that they aim at portraying. These are perfect examples of valuable thin descriptions. I was recently quite shocked to discover that in a recent book, world-famous anthropologist Tim Engold states that Geertz's understanding of life is of a movement towards terminal closure, something that resonates very well with my critique of his thick descriptions. Spinning further on this, Engold says, "It is the essence of life, that it does not begin here or end there, or connect the point of origin with a final destination, but rather that it keeps going, finding a way through the myriad of things that form, persist, and break up in its currents. Life, in short, is a movement of opening, not of closure. As such, it should lie at the very heart of anthropological concern." Engold's vision of life as a flowing continuum inevitably requires from us to inhabit the world, to dwell in it, rather than to observe it from a safety distance. His words resonate with those of Pavel Florensky again, for whom philosophy and art were much better off to interpret life as compared to science. While the language of science, and I quote, "prohibits movements and transfers of thought, constricting the observer in an iron headrest and forcing him to wear blinkers," these are his words, philosophy acknowledged that the lived world requires a living observer of life, and not the rigid and conventional unmovability. allowing the emergence of wonder, which, by the way, in Francis Bacon's view, was the true seed of knowledge. Philosophy may not provide answers, but rather continuously feed in a process that Paul Rabinow recently addressed to the notion of inquiry, new and more refined questions. So, and I conclude, if we are to accept, as suggested by Merleau-Ponty, but also by much Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, that observation is rooted in the body-mind complex of a subject actively involved with the world, then we have to acknowledge that thick descriptions, caught as they are in the politics of separation, may run the risk to solidify what is liquid, to conflate the river for the river bank, the water for the waves. Just like Renaissance perspective did to the viewer, the thick kicks the human out of the world. We may not need new images to teach us this, but they can surely give us a helping hand, pushing us to rediscover the preciousness of the thin, of that moment when the world presents itself to us in all its impermanence, frailty and contradiction. Foregrounding presence, closeness and reciprocality, new images remind us that the world is not what I think, but what I live through. Thank you.